I know this is probably going to be the easiest video I'll ever have to record on this channel because we're talking about the Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne. Talking about this man's legacy, his private life, the crazy things he did when he was on tour and hotels, his work with Black Sabbath, and his solo career would take me more than one video, actually probably more than 2 videos because there's so much to cover. I've been lucky enough to enjoy this man's discography multiple times, and that is exactly why I thought he was a great candidate for a new episode of the Overrated series where we take your favorite artists and ask the question, are they overrated? As you guys may or may not know, depending on whether or not you watch my videos, we use 4 different categories to decide at the very end of the video if he's overrated or not. These categories are popularity, performance, influence, and discography. Now, of course, I always give my reasoning in each category why I think he's overrated or not, but at the end of the day, this is still my personal opinion, so I'm pretty sure you have your own. Why don't you leave it down below in the comments so we can all take a look at your opinion and have a conversation based on it. We have 4 categories to get through. I don't really want to make this video too long, so let's go on with the first category, popularity. I say it all the time every time I make one of these videos. Popularity for me is the most irrelevant category because I personally don't really care how many people listen to your music. If I like the music, that's pretty much all I need. But when it comes to Ozzy, the answer is pretty clear. And actually, I believe that in every single category, the answer is going to be quite obvious. Ozzy is one of the most famous musicians of all time. You know, his title as the Prince of Darkness was not only given to him because he was one of the first to infuse rock music with this gloomy, heavier, and darker sound that created metal music, but also because of his popularity, because of how controversial he was. He was always on the news because of things he liked to do when he was on hotels or on tours. You know, there's a lot of famous stories about him biting the head of a bat. I'm pretty sure you've heard that one. But there's also many more, like him biting the head of a dove too, him killing his 17 cats with a shotgun, and also snorting ants because he didn't have any cocaine while on tour with Motley Crue. I mean, the guy has 1,000 stories to tell. I'd love to have a beer with this guy because you're not gonna be bored when talking to Ozzy Osbourne, you know. That's if you can understand what he's saying, because the man likes to...
He's sober now?
No, yeah.
Let's just say he's not a scholar when it comes to oral speech, you know. That's outside of music. Once you jump into the actual albums and the songs, he is still one of the best-selling artists of all time. If we count his albums with Black Sabbath and his solo discography in albums like Diary of a Madman and Blizzard of Oz, he sold more than 100 million records, which is quite an impressive amount for a solo artist, or at least for the most part a solo artist. He has multiple platinum albums. Even his most recent release, Patient Number 9, was a huge commercial success. You also have his reality show on MTV, his Ozfest, you know, a good opportunity for a lot of metal bands to find airplay. There's so many things that can be said about Ozzy Osbourne as a public figure that it's almost impossible to say that he's overrated in this regard. Whether or not you'd like to say that, you know, it was his antics that made him so popular, okay, I can see that argument being made, but his music was still amazing. He managed to be at the top of the charts constantly. He put out incredible songs for more than 2 decades constantly. So I can't really see anyone making the argument that the only reason why he was popular was because of the crazy things he liked to do outside of the studio. You know, his music was a huge part of the reason why he became such a popular rock star. But I can understand, you know, it's a little annoying that nowadays he's seen as a celebrity rather than a rock star, because we're talking about one of the greatest and most influential artists of all time, that seeing them in such a family mood can feel a little weird. I can understand that, but still, he's definitely not overrated in terms of popularity. He's one of the most popular rock stars of all time. Now let's go with influence, and this is probably the easiest category to say that he's not overrated because we're talking about the father of metal music, the godfather of metal music, basically. The reason why people call him that is because the self-titled album by Black Sabbath is the very first metal album ever made. Prior to Black Sabbath, there were already some rock bands that were playing around with a heavier sound. You have Who, Jimi Hendrix, and you also have, obviously, Led Zeppelin, you know, the closest thing we had to a metal band prior to Black Sabbath. But the release of their self-titled record is the birth of metal music. And then every album after that, from Paranoid to Master of Reality to Sabotage to Volume 4, all of those records were incredibly influential when it comes to the metal music scene in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. There's almost no metal band out there that don't put Black Sabbath as a major source of inspiration for their own craft, you know. And not only because they were the first, it's also the fact that those early Black Sabbath albums are among the greatest pieces of metal music, and actually music overall, to ever be released. I mean, Master of Reality, my favorite Black Sabbath album in my opinion, is high up there in the top 20, maybe even top 10 greatest albums of all time. Paranoid was incredibly influential thanks to the title track, songs like Iron Man and War Pigs. You know, no one used vocals, guitars, and percussion the way Black Sabbath did. You know, it feels so heavy and dark. You can hear the anger and desperation in Ozzy's voice in every single one of the tracks, and the ones that were a little slower or maybe more close to a ballad type of metal music, like the song Changes, for example, showed that you don't necessarily have to be constantly loud and energetic in order to make metal music. Metal could take many forms and shapes, you know. Black Sabbath is the band that introduced that idea, and a really big part of Black Sabbath, actually I would argue that the biggest part, and I know that this is a little controversial, but it was Ozzy. You know, he was the face of Black Sabbath. He was the Prince of Darkness for a reason, the most popular member out of the band. He was a major influence for the metal music scene, and for that reason there's no way that I can say that he's overrated in terms of influence. This is simply no way. Now let's go with performance, and this is going to be a little more interesting because in my opinion Ozzy Osbourne is one of the greatest singers of all time. Once again, not only because of his technical ability, he didn't really have much, and that is the reason why his voice in the 90s and the 2000s and obviously nowadays doesn't really sound as good as, you know, back in the 80s and 70s when he was starting his career. He clearly pushed his voice beyond its limits, and it paid off. But it brought a lot of consequences too. You know, his voice was not the same after the 80s. Don't get me wrong, he can still pull off some great performances. I'm probably going to put a few examples here of some very recent performances. But I think we can all agree that it's not the same. But while he was at its peak, when he was able to pull off this incredibly raw, scary, you know, menacing vocals in albums like Paranoid, albums like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, he was one of the greatest of all time, and that is the reason why I personally don't think that he was overrated in terms of performance. No one else could perform like Ozzy Osbourne back then, and that is the reason why firing Ozzy took so long. I mean, ever since the mid-70s, the band members like Tommy Iommi, Bill Ward had massive issues with the way Ozzy was behaving. His alcoholism and, you know, his drug addiction was at its peak, and he was making the recordings of the albums were more complicated and longer than they should be, and that wasn't to the band's taste. So that's why they decided to fire him in 1979, I think it was. And even though Ozzy said that the other band members were as alcoholic and as, you know, addict as he was, I personally think that Ozzy was always way more reactive to alcohol and drugs, because he was doing some really crazy stuff back then. And even though Ronnie James Dio is an incredible singer, after he left Black Sabbath, the band didn't release a single album that matched the level of genius that the early Black Sabbath albums reached, you know. And I'm pretty sure that that might have happened even if Ozzy stayed. The fact that he left and he went on to have a really successful solo career with albums like Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, and Bark at the Moon kind of proves that a big part of the reason why Black Sabbath was so successful was thanks to Ozzy, even though he wasn't the one directly writing the songs, or maybe not the one coming up with the melodies for the tracks. So considering the fact that his voice was the last piece of the puzzle to one of the greatest discographies of all time, I think it's kind of impossible to say that his performance style was overrated, okay, or is overrated. And when you look at the live performances, it's pretty much the same. I mean, he was the main catch. Tony Iommi's guitar playing is always going to be incredible, and it's always going to be, you know, the most impressive factor of Black Sabbath discography, because in my opinion, if someone deserves the title of the creator of metal music, it's pretty much him, you know, not Ozzy. But in the live performances, Ozzy, his crazy antics and all the things he liked to do to entertain the crowd was the main catch of the concert. So as a live performer, he was not overrated either. Conclusion, in terms of performance, he's not overrated. Now let's go with the most important category. I say it every time I make one of these videos. If you win in the discography category, you win the entire thing, because the discography is the actual albums, the actual songs. Your legacy as a musician is comprised in your discography. And when it comes to Ozzy, I think the answer is also very clear. When you study his discography past the mid-80s, you'll find that a lot of those albums are quite mediocre, and some of them are actually really bad. But it's everything prior to that that show that he's one of the greatest musicians of all time, and that's the reason why no one questions Ozzy, you know, when he's brought up in all these conversations of some of the most influential musicians ever, and he's high up there with the greatest. You know, no one questions that, because the early Black Sabbath albums, starting at Black Sabbath, going through Paranoid, Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage, and then you jump into his solo discography. I know about Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, but I don't really like those albums that much. That's why I don't count them. But going into his solo discography, you'll find Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, Bark at the Moon. And recently he has released projects that maybe don't reach the same heights as a lot of his work from the 80s and 70s, but that doesn't really mean they're bad, because Patient Number 9 is actually a really good album. Ordinary Man has some good songs in it, and if you want to count 13, you know, the reunion of Black Sabbath, it does have quite a few good tunes in there too, and it's a really good album. The only problem is that, you know, production kind of ruined the whole thing, making every track louder and louder, and it's obvious that Ozzy was not able to keep up with that sort of volume anymore, you know, and that's fine. They didn't really need it to do that. It was a huge waste, that album. It was a really good opportunity, and they had some good tunes to put on there too, but that's a topic for another day. For the most part, when you look at Ozzy's discography, you're going to find some of the best metal albums ever, some of the most influential ones, some of the best guitar playing ever, and I know that he wasn't the one playing the guitar. A lot of the times he wasn't the one writing the lyrics. He wasn't the one even coming up with the melodies, you know, but once again, his performance was a very big part of the whole formula. You know, without Ozzy, you don't have the completed puzzle, and I think that only because of that, you need to give him a lot of credit for every album he released, because it's a running argument saying that Ozzy is overrated because he wasn't that big of a participant in the writing of these songs, because the lyrics were thanks to Geezer Butler in the Black Sabbath albums, the guitar playing was Tommy Iommi, and the drumming was Bill Ward, so they should get more credit than Ozzy. They should be bigger than Ozzy, and they should be considered the grandfathers of metal music. And I can see what you're saying, but we do have quite a few Black Sabbath albums that don't have Ozzy in them, and I think it's very clear to anybody that has listened to those albums that it's not the same. It's simply not the same, and you can't tell me that after he changed to a solo career with a totally different band, with a different aesthetic, with a different sound, he also succeeded. It was thanks to those musicians now. It wasn't thanks to him at all. You know, that's a silly argument. Obviously, Ozzy was a really big part of the success, the influence, and the greatness of both Black Sabbath, his solo discography, and every other project he participated in. So in terms of discography, because of incredible albums, I'm going to name them again so you can have a scope of the greatness of this man. Black Sabbath, Paranoid, Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage, Blizzard of Oz, and Diary of a Madman. All these albums I just mentioned are among the greatest pieces of metal music ever, and the fact that the only thing they have in common is that Ozzy Osbourne was an active participant in every single one of these albums is ridiculous. You know, it's remarkable, and that is the reason why I cannot say ever, I couldn't say it, that Ozzy Osbourne is overrated in terms of discography.
Someone has been in my room and taken my beers away from my room.
I don't think so, darling. Who would do that?
Making a conclusion for this video would be kind of silly, because I think I made my point clear even at the very beginning of the video. You know, with the introduction, it should be clear that I was about to glaze all over Ozzy for the entirety of the runtime of this video. It's going to be about 15 minutes, 10 minutes long. And I know that sometimes I can be a little biased. I know that a lot of aspects about his performance and his artistry overall are a little overrated, but saying that he's overrated overall is kind of ridiculous, is impossible. We're talking about the face of metal music, the grandfather of metal music, the most influential figure in the genre, the one that put out some of the best albums the genre has to offer. A guy that has been active for more than 50 years and is still releasing amazing music, because again, go and listen to Patient Number 9. Maybe it's not going to be as great as, you know, the early Black Sabbath stuff or his early solo career albums in the 80s, but it's definitely a great listen from the metal music genre. So the fact that this man still has so many ideas and so much energy and so much passion for the music he started to record and write 50 years ago is remarkable to me. There's no way that I can say that this man is overrated. And if we're talking about the Black Sabbath band, I think that that's, you know, a different argument because it goes beyond Ozzy. They released a bunch of albums without him and they were not the best thing in the world, although some of them were really good. As I said before, you know, Heaven and Hell, I think it's the best example. But for the most part, you know, even though he relied heavily on his bandmates and on the people that were around him, that doesn't change the fact that he was responsible for building what in my opinion is the biggest and greatest legacy of the metal music genre. And for that reason, there's no way in hell that I can say that Ozzy Osbourne is overrated. He's definitely not. When people say he's one of the greatest of all time, they're telling the truth.
So you listen to a lot of Justin Bieber? Are we gonna Justin Bieber?
Who the fuck's Justin Bieber?
Good.
I had a lot of fun revisiting his discography. I love every excuse I can to go back and listen to this man's output. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video as well. If you did, you can go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, album, or artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed. I hope that I can see you soon with a new video, but until then, bye.